After over 50 years of harboring a Cold War grudge, yesterday Obama announced that the government would start normalizing relations with Cuba.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people and begin a new chapter among the nations of the Americas.
It's a new chapter that has confused many, considering that for the last 5 decades, this government has relentlessly tried to isolate and undermine the Cuban government. So joining me now to talk about this change in policy and the influence of economic issues on foreign policy, activist and author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins. Always amazing to have you on, John.
Abby, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So, John, you've spoken extensively, of course, about how economic hitmen are used to sway world leaders into embracing neoliberalism. If that doesn't work, jackals are sent in. Talk about the history of this strategy in Cuba.
Well, you know, I think it's been really convenient for us to have a whipping boy in Latin America, and that's been Cuba. And whenever anything went wrong, so whenever anybody's turned against the United States, and often justifiably so, we always blamed Cuba. You know, we said that Cuba was behind whatever happened in Nicaragua and in Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela and many other places. So it's been very, very convenient for us to do that. And yet, in the last 10 years, since 2002, things have changed radically in Latin America. It really goes back to 2002 when Hugo Chavez stood up to the CIA. He overcame a CIA coup. And that sent a very strong message throughout Latin America that the CIA was a paper tiger. And so since then, 10 countries have brought in democratically elected presidents. And they've done it very successfully, and every one of these 10 countries during most of my lifetime had brutal dictators, usually supported by the CIA, usually put into power by the CIA. And so suddenly things have really, really changed. And I think the United States is recognizing that this whipping boy thing is no longer serving anybody's interests. And as Obama himself said, the sanctions haven't been successful, so why continue?
Good point. I guess my angle is, I don't see the media really talking about these recent initiatives to try to undermine Cuba's leadership. Of course, we have the Bay of Pigs, Operation Northwoods, all these assassination attempts with the Castro regime, but they never stopped trying, John. In just the last 5 years, Obama tried to foment dissent in the country with a fake Cuban Twitter called Zunzunio, a fake HIV program under USAID. Clearly, socialism still stands at odds with U.S. hegemony. Do you see any hidden motives contained in the policy shift?
Well, I think the hidden motive is a recognition that the world is changing radically. And, you know, come on, if the United States really had wanted to take out the Cuban administration one way or another, I think they could have done it. They couldn't do it with Chavez because he was a lot stronger. Venezuela is a stronger country. But they were able to do it with Rolos of Ecuador and Torrijos of Panama, and more recently Zelaya of Honduras. And the attempted coup against Correa in Ecuador a couple of years ago, it was a failed coup, but I think it intentionally failed. And after that, Correa totally changed his policy. He embraced oil companies where previously he had been keeping them out of his country, had been really reining them in. So the United States has a lot of ways to control countries. And I really think it was not to the United States' best interest to get rid of the regime in Cuba, because what real harm did that regime do in Cuba? And as I said before, it served as a magnificent whipping boy, the enemy in Latin America that we could blame everything on when things went wrong in our own policy.
I hope you're so right, and I hope that Congress really follows suit and lifts that embargo, because it's super crippling. And of course, the last 50 years have been such an example of extreme economic warfare against Cuba. This is hardly anything new. You wrote recently about how free trade is really a death economy next door. Why haven't trade policies like NAFTA and CAFTA spurred economic growth?
Oh, because they're totally skewed to the big corporations. You know, they've done the opposite of spurring economic growth. They've made these inequality much greater in every country where they've been impacted. The TPP alliance that's now being very, very strongly promoted by the United States is in the same area. The immigration problem in the United States has really been caused by the United States. It's been caused by our supposedly free trade agreements with these countries, because it sets it up so that the big corporations have a huge advantage. American farm growers the big corporate farm growers of corn and cotton in the United States can now sell corn and cotton cheaper in places like Mexico than Mexican peasants can sell it, even though Mexican peasants produced it for much less money. But because of the subsidies in the United States, these peasants have been taken out of business. They can't survive anymore, so they're swarming across the borders. If we want to stop immigration in the United States, the way to do that is to build up the economies of this country. Just 2 days ago, I came back from Peru, and in another couple of weeks I leave for Guatemala. I spent a lot of time in Latin America. The people who live in these countries, most of them don't want to live in the United States. They come here, they work hard, they send their money home, but they would really rather be there. Their economies don't support that because the big corporations, through these free trade agreements, have essentially destroyed their economies.
You know, it's amazing because we know how disastrous they've been, yet, there's this TPP thing. D.C. just hosted the latest round of negotiations. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This so-called trade deal is insane. I mean, talk about what this would do to solidify the death economy.
Absolutely. And I talk a lot about that we have a death economy today, one that's based on militarization to a large degree and on ravaging, raping the earth, and exploiting people all over the world. You know that today, 7 out of 10 people in the world population live in countries where inequality has increased in the last 30 years. And most of these countries have taken huge loans from the World Bank and the IMF. And exactly the opposite of what the mission of the World Bank and the IMF states, that it wants to get rid of poverty. Exactly the opposite has happened. These trade agreements are there to help big business, what I call the corporatocracy, to promote the death economy. We, the people, though, I think are beginning to get it all over the world. I travel all over the world constantly. I was in Romania recently, and as I said, Latin America recently, and in England. I travel around everywhere I go. I find that people really are waking up to the fact that the 99% is being terribly exploited by the 1%.
It seems to me like the TPP is kind of the corporatocracy's checkmate on us all. I mean, why do you think there's barely any media coverage of a deal that would supersede the sovereignty and national legislation of the countries involved?
Oh, come on, Abby. Now, you work for a media outlet where you can say these things, but the media, for the most part in the United States and throughout much of the world, is controlled by the big corporations. You can't get away with even talking about these things. That's why they're not talking about it, because they're owned by the corporatocracy, either outright or through advertising budgets.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the World Bank really quickly, because you mentioned it earlier and how it plays a role in all of this. I think it's interesting that the World Bank is kind of switching over, pledging billions of dollars to privatize water in countries like Bangladesh. What do you think this shift over to resource management signifies?
Well, it signifies the tremendous importance to the world on these resources. Let's face it, we know that water is the next oil. It's getting scarce, and the world needs it terribly. And the World Bank now, I think, is in a rather desperate situation, because BRICS, this bank that's been formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and this Mercosur, South American Bank, and there's all these things rising up, these new institutions that are directly competing with the World Bank. So in a way, I think the World Bank feels that it's kind of in a death throw, and it's got to take advantage of everything it can as quickly as it can. At the same time, I also think it's realizing that it needs to change its policies if it's going to compete. We're in a situation today, Abby, that's not unlike the Cold War. So back when there was the Cold War, if countries were upset with the way the United States was treating them, like Brazil or Ecuador or Nigeria or someplace else, they could turn to Russia, or they could threaten to turn to Russia, the Soviet Union. But after détente and that all dried up, the United States was the sole superpower. That's no longer true. Now you've got China emerging, you've got India emerging, you've got Brazil emerging, you've got Russia emerging. And when they come together, as they're doing in BRICS, it's a very, very strong impediment to the advancement of the corporatocracy that's under the U.S. control. So something fascinating is happening in the world today.
It is indeed, and of course, kind of seizing on those commons, the water, air. I mean, what's next? Privatizing air, but it is amazing to see kind of this shift over what the next big war on resources will be. John, of course, you've immersed yourself in other cultures. It's incredible just looking at how much traveling you're doing with shamans, indigenous tribes. Recently, you tweeted, "Lesson from the indigenous people around the world. The farther we wander from a connection to nature, the more our culture faces chaos." John, talk about the lessons you've learned about nature through your journeys and how we can get people to reconnect with nature in such a hyper-materialistic society.
Well, we really need to move into a life economy, which is out of this death economy. And a life economy is based on recognizing our vulnerability and our relationship, our connection to the earth. In a life economy, instead of spending 20% plus of the U.S. budget to kill people for the military, you'd spend that to help starving people and hungry people and sick people take care of themselves better. You'd spend it, instead of creating more pollution, let's get the big companies to clean up pollution. There's tremendous pollution. There's a whole economy out there waiting to happen. And it's also recognition that we are part of nature. It's not like nature's out there. Nature's here, and the indigenous people have always known this, and that's how they've been so successful for thousands of years at maintaining themselves. We need to get that too. We need to build an economy that revolves around our connection with the earth, our recognition that we're interdependent with the earth. And we've gone exactly the opposite direction during the past decades, the past century, in fact, since the Industrial Revolution. And now it's time to understand that and to completely turn it over, to change it, and to create a whole new form of economic development. You know, I'm not opposed to growth at all. I'm opposed to the kind of growth that we've had in the past. We need to reach a new kind of growth. You know, if you walk through the streets of Calcutta or Rio de Janeiro or parts of New York City, you recognize that there's a lot of hungry people. We need growth to feed these people. We need growth in cleaning up the environment. There's so many things that need to be done. It's just that we need to direct it in ways that are very different from the ones we've directed in the past. And it should not be directed toward maximizing profits for a few wealthy billionaires. That's the way it's going today.
I couldn't agree more, and I just fear that this is kind of this autonomous machine at this point working on its own. I mean, this predatory capitalist corporatist monster, John, and you're right, people are waking up, and we have to keep looking at the positive things that are going on, which are really everywhere. Thank you so much for being a part of that global shift in consciousness. John Perkins, activist, author, really appreciate your insight.